In March 2024, protests broke out in Cuba as growing food shortages and energy price rises saw people take to the streets of several cities in a rare show of unrest. Having turned to the United Nations for emergency assistance, the Cuban government has since accused the United States of being behind the demonstrations. But while Washington vehemently denies this, the claims have again highlighted the tense relationship between the two countries. So, what exactly lies behind the current crisis, and could the communist regime in Cuba really be on the verge of collapse? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Kerr-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. Around the world, many neighbouring countries have strained relations. However, few examples are quite as interesting as the tensions between the United States and Cuba. Despite being the world's most powerful state, the US has had a long, complex and often embattled relationship with this small island. For over 60 years, and often to the bemusement of outside observers, Washington has seen the country as an existential threat. It's imposed harsh economic, political and social restrictions on Cuba that many see as a vindictive overreaction and which have been repeatedly condemned by the rest of the world. But for its part, the United States sees Cuba as an autocratic, single-party state that not only denies its citizens fundamental democratic and social freedoms and tramples on human rights, but has also undermined US interests more broadly over many decades. But could all this be about to change? The Republic of Cuba is in the Caribbean. Its neighbours are Haiti to its east, Jamaica to the south and Mexico to the west. The United States lies 150 kilometres or 90 miles to its north. Altogether, it's around 110,000 square kilometres or 42,000 square miles. The country's population stands at around 11.3 million and is of mixed ancestry. As well as descendants of Spanish colonial settlers and enslaved Africans, it includes immigrant communities from across Europe, Asia and the Middle East. According to the World Bank, the country's per capita GDP in 2020 was around $9,500 US. This was roughly in line with the average for Latin America and the Caribbean. Cuba has a long and fascinating history. First sighted by Christopher Columbus during his voyage to the New World in 1492, during the 16th and 17th century, the island was central to the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere, as well as being a staging post for Spanish activities to the rest of the Americas and a key port for Spanish treasure fleets returning to Europe. It became an important agricultural hub, growing tobacco and sugar. However, while most of Spain's empire in the Americas was lost in the first quarter of the 19th century, Cuba remained under Madrid's control. As a result, pressure began to grow for statehood. This led to the Cuban War of Independence in 1895. Following several years of fighting, the turning point came in 1898 when a US warship exploded in Havana Harbour, prompting Washington to declare war on Spain. Just months later, the Spanish government sued for peace. Under the Treaty of Paris, Cuba passed to the United States. 4 years later, in 1902, it became independent. From the start, the new country was troubled by political instability, and over the following decades it faced frequent changes of government and revolts. All the while, the United States retained considerable influence over the island's affairs, in addition to establishing a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which remains under heavily guarded American control even to this day. The US was also given the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, a power that it used on several occasions. Meanwhile, American companies controlled large parts of the economy, including the vital sugar industry. Having led a military coup in 1933, Fulgencio Batista became Cuba's strongman until, in 1940, he was elected president. Although he gave up power at the end of his 4-year term and moved to the United States, he ran again in 1952. This time, he was determined to retain control. Facing defeat, he staged a military coup. Back in power, Batista oversaw a brutal and repressive regime. This set the stage for an uprising led by a young revolutionary, Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, and an Argentinian, Che Guevara. Despite getting off to a bad start with a failed attack on a military barracks in 1956, the guerrilla campaign steadily gained momentum. And on the 1st of January 1959, Batista fled Cuba. 6 weeks later, Castro became Prime Minister. Although Washington initially recognized Castro's government, relations quickly deteriorated. The turning point came when the new regime nationalized various American-owned properties and businesses without compensation. In retaliation, the US imposed sanctions and a trade embargo, and even supported an attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. Facing growing economic difficulties and hardening US opposition, Castro now turned to the Soviet Union for help. This came to a head in October 1962 with the discovery of Soviet ballistic missile bases on the island. Following a 13-day confrontation that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, the crisis was eventually diffused when Washington and Moscow agreed to dismantle their missile bases in Cuba and Turkey. Following this, over the next 2 decades, the US remained steadfastly opposed to Castro. Aside from opposing a significant communist presence on its doorstep, the Cuban leader was seen to challenge US authority by providing military and political assistance to rebel groups and left-wing governments across Latin America and Africa. Although Cuba's dependence on the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact allowed the country to build a good standard of living despite the US economic embargo, everything changed with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Having lost its benefactor, Cuba faced significant hardships with food, medicine and fuel shortages. However, while Havana implemented strict austerity measures and took initial steps to open the economy to tourism, investment and private enterprise, Castro nevertheless retained tight control over the country under his one-party system. As a result, Washington, backed by a large and vocal Cuban exile community, hardened its position against the Castro regime. Condemning the country's lack of democracy and its restrictions on human rights, Congress passed several pieces of legislation further isolating the country and even allowing for punitive action against governments and companies doing business with Cuba. While the hope was that this would bring down the Castro regime, Cuba instead became increasingly self-sufficient. As a result, towards the end of the Clinton administration in the late 1990s, Washington adopted a new approach that eased travel restrictions and opened the way for more significant people-to-people contact. But the détente was short-lived. The new Bush administration, which came to power in 2001, reinforced the embargo and reimposed travel restrictions. In 2008, Fidel Castro stepped down after almost 50 years in power and was replaced by his brother, Raul. Meanwhile, a year later, a new US administration took power under Barack Obama. This paved the way for a thaw in relations. Focusing on engagement rather than isolation, the two countries began cooperating in several areas, such as tackling drug trafficking and migration. All this led to a historic breakthrough in 2014 when Cuba and the United States officially announced that they would begin normalizing relations. In addition to reopening the embassies in Havana and Washington, travel restrictions were eased and the State Department removed Cuba from its list of state sponsors of terrorism. Crucially though, the embargo remained in force as this could only be lifted with congressional approval. But while it seemed that a new relationship was starting, it again proved short-lived. Citing ongoing human rights violations and Cuba's support for Venezuela, which was becoming increasingly opposed to the United States, the Trump administration, which came to power in early 2017, not only reversed many of the steps, but also tightened up the long-standing embargo. Although many expected that the Biden administration would resume efforts to engage with Cuba, especially after Raul Castro stepped down in April 2021, thus ending 60 years of Castro family rule on the island, there was no return to the Obama-era détente. While steps were taken to ease travel restrictions, the core of the embargo remained intact as the US continued to cite human rights abuses. In the meantime, tensions began to grow again in other ways. Although Cuba lost a crucial ally when the Soviet Union collapsed, it nevertheless remained on good terms with Russia. This came to the fore with the start of the war in Ukraine in early 2022. Although Cuba abstained on the General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in the face of growing Western sanctions, Moscow and Havana stepped up their economic, political and military cooperation. Tensions were also stoked by reports that Cubans had signed up to the Russian army, although Havana insisted it wasn't part of the war and vehemently opposed any efforts to recruit its citizens. To add to all this, in December 2023, a former US ambassador was arrested and charged with spying for Cuba over many decades. So, what lies behind the current situation? Ultimately, it comes down to a combination of factors. Having been hit especially hard by the pandemic, as well as by worldwide inflation and fuel shortages, and still struggling under the US embargo, Cuba has now sunk into its most severe economic crisis since the end of the Cold War. On the 1st of March 2024, the government imposed a 500% fuel price increase. Meanwhile, the country faces growing shortages of other vital items, including baby milk and medicines. This, in turn, has seen Havana make an urgent and unprecedented plea to the United Nations World Food Programme for urgent support. In addition, Cuba has also been hit by waves of power outages. In the face of such serious problems, widespread anger appears to be growing. All this came to international attention with reports of protests in Santiago de Cuba, the country's second largest city, as well as in other towns and villages. While Cuban officials insist that steps are underway to address the country's problems, the demonstrations have further heightened tensions between Havana and Washington. Summoning the most senior US diplomat based in the country to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Cuban government directly accused the United States of having a hand in instigating the unrest and interfering in Cuba's internal affairs. In response, Washington has officially denied any involvement in the events, insisting that the accusations are absurd. However, calling on Havana to show restraint, American officials have also left little doubt that Washington stands fully behind the Cuban people's right to enjoy democracy and fundamental freedoms. Of course, many wonder what happens next. Will the unrest be contained, or could it mark the start of a far more substantial challenge to the authority of the ruling Communist Party? In truth, it's hard to say. While Cuba has a long history of quelling dissent, history has shown elsewhere that such situations can rapidly escalate. In the meantime, both sides have portrayed the protests as part of a larger, longer-term struggle for the Cuban people's right to self-determination. For Havana, it's about a powerful neighbour that has a long history of interfering in Cuban affairs and which has imposed a punishing and cruel embargo on the country for little more than daring to oppose its control. Meanwhile, for Washington, the confrontation is about ongoing efforts to end a crumbling one-party communist regime that has deprived the people of Cuba of their democratic and human rights for far too long. I hope you found that useful. If so, here's another video that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.